All right. It looks like we have begun streaming. So welcome everybody tonight. Thank you to those of you who were patient with us as we worked through some technical difficulties. My name is Race McCray. I am the Human Relations Manager for the City of High Point. And just in case other folks are kind of joining us who missed last week and don't know kind of what we're doing, I'm going to give you a brief orientation. This is the second of our housing security workshops. The Human Relations Commission was tasked in January of this year by the City Council to explore the feasibility of High Point becoming a fair housing assistance program. Last week, which you can find archived on our YouTube, we had our first of these housing security workshops where we discussed the certification process and kind of gave an overview of how a FAP agency works. This second workshop, we're going to have two presenters. I am going to first begin with a history of fair housing in High Point and some of the actions that have happened in the recent history, beginning about 2005. Some of you may be familiar with those, but I'll talk a bit more of those as we go along. And then after that, we'll get a presentation from Mike McNair, the Director of Community Development at the City of High Point, and he's going to talk about the analysis of impediments, which is a report that we produce on a regular basis to talk about kind of various needs for housing needs in High Point. And I'll let him explain that more when we get there. So I also want to welcome all of our guests. We are joined tonight by a number of invited guests who have chosen to be part of these workshops. We have members from our High Point Regional Association of Realtors, and I thank you all for joining us. We also have some of our members of our Human Relations Commission. We have members of from community leadership in various organizations. And we're also joined by some of our esteemed council members, including Tyrone Johnson, our liaison for the Human Relations Commission to Council. So thank you all for joining us. Tonight, because we're talking about history, we've also, I just want to acknowledge that we also have a number of folks who were here for part of that history, including Bernita Sims and Cam Criddlebow, and both of those, and also Mike McNair. And I'm sure there are others of you who were here and were perhaps even a part of these events. Although I am going to be talking about the history, you may hear folks sometimes jump in to talk about some other parts of the history that I'm not discussing. So that's why they've been invited, to make sure that we are producing this as accurately and transparently as possible. So I'm going to begin by, are there any questions before we get started, or any other comments that need to be made at the beginning here? I also noticed that Councilman member Michael Holmes is also in our panelist list. Sorry, I did not see you there earlier. And so thank you also for joining us as well. If there are no other statements to be made at the beginning, then, and we're also joined by some city staff members as well. Managing Director Jerron Hollis from the Community and Public Engagement, Communications and Public Engagement Department, which Human Relations is a part of. And we're also joined by Jelani Biggs, who is our presenter last week. And Jelani is our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for the City of High Point. And Jelani also has some extra insight into these issues, sometimes as an expert, because he previously worked in Winston-Salem's Fair Housing Assistance Program, and also was the previous Human Relations Manager in this position. So that kind of gives you a nice overview of some of the folks on the call. I'm sure there are others, all of whom are important. So thank you for joining us. So I'm going to begin by sharing my screen for my first presentation. Are folks able to see that?
I am.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of fair housing in High Point. And I'm going to only be addressing the kind of relatively recent history, beginning in about 2005, which is kind of our most recent foray into fair housing. So just to give you some goals for this presentation, when we've talked about fair housing in the past, we've heard a lot of folks who were involved in these events who have presented to us various aspects of the history and how that relates to our current project. And so as I was looking at this history, I noticed that everyone is right. They've got all sorts of great shared experiences. So I wanted to bring us together in particular to establish a shared narrative of how High Point has addressed fair housing since 2005, since I think that it can be a complicated set of events. I also want to address some misunderstandings about High Point's fair housing efforts. So I think that sometimes because these happened over so many years, there's a lot of different viewpoints on what happened. Also recognize areas of common concern, some things that have been brought up in the past that have come up again and again that we can maybe address. And finally, clarify how our current approach is different than the things we've done in the past. And I want to be clear also that this presentation relied primarily on minutes of public meetings. And so this includes all the public record, basically, of how these events transpired. And we're not seeking to interpret, defend, or question the past practices. I've not set out to interpret, essentially, what has happened before now. This is an objective statement of the things that we did before now that have brought us to this point. So just to start out in the beginning with 2005, in July 2005, the Human Relations Commission amended their bylaws to establish a fair housing standing committee. And this reflected an increasing interest on the commission's part in fair housing. And you're going to see that I continually use abbreviations for these slides. I'll try to clarify them when they happen. So at that time, due to concerns about how fair housing complaints were addressed, the Human Relations Manager, which was Al Higgins, I will abbreviate as HRM, suggested that HRC, the Human Relations Commission, consider a fair housing ordinance that they could propose to be adopted by council that would be modeled after the fair housing ordinance that had been adopted in Charlotte. And this is part of the process that we referred to last week, that when an agency is seeking to become a fair housing assistance program, they develop a local ordinance and then submit that to HUD to be established as substantially equivalent to federal laws. So that is what was going on in this instance. In February 2006, so roughly 7 months later, the Human Relations Manager met with representatives from the High Point Regional Association of Realtors to discuss the fair housing ordinance. And at that time, the realtors were able to have a great discussion with the Human Relations Manager and was expressed some support for this ordinance being passed. Again, 7 months later, in 2006, October, the Community Development Director, Mike McNair, who is again on this call tonight, he addressed the Human Relations Commission about the recent analysis of impediments. And I'm going to let him explain what the analysis of impediments is. I'm just going to give a brief summary here, which is that it identified some of the impediments, some of the barriers that the city was having to furthering fair housing. So basically, when we're trying as a city to create fair housing, which we do as part of our agreement to get federal funding, we have to continually address what ways could we improve on that. And so he addressed the Human Relations Commission about the recent report that he had helped write. In the next year, February 2007, again, Mike McNair, the Community Development Director, and the Human Relations Manager presented the analysis of impediments and the fair housing ordinance that had been created by the Human Relations Commission at the city manager's briefing. So this is the one that they had modeled on Charlotte, and we're presenting this to the managers, for the city managers to consider for adoption. And subsequently, in the March 2007 city council meeting, that ordinance was presented to council. And at that point, a few weeks later, council considered the matter and basically requested further input. So later in March, at a separate meeting, council met with representatives from HUD to get clarification on the ordinance and implementation. And that meeting was particularly useful. It seems they got a lot of feedback and a further clarification on how that would work. and were therefore able to kind of approve and move forward. So just a few months later, then in May 2007, council was considering the budget for the next year and approved as part of that, that the Human Relations Department would hire a human relations specialist in anticipation of an ordinance being passed. So this indicates that they expected that that would be passed, so they included in their budget that they would have the option to hire an investigator in the next year. That is in no way a guarantee that they absolutely expected it to pass, but it was something that they were considering as a crucial error and wanted to budget in advance. In November of that year, the local fair housing ordinance was passed. So again, this would be the first step in achieving substantial equivalence. And importantly, when you have an ordinance and it has passed, it immediately goes into effect. And you'll see that that has significance for what happens next. Excuse
me, Rafe.
Yep.
Yeah, I don't know if you addressed how if people have questions along the way.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. We should probably pause. Are there any questions up to that point? Because at this point, we've moved through how they developed that first ordinance and then that it was effective, successfully passed in 2007. Are there any questions at that point or comments? And I'll take a brief pause at the end of every slide to give an opportunity for questions at that point. So seeing none, and I don't see any in the chat as well. And Brandon, please let me know if you see some in the chat, since I'm looking at the presentation, it's possible that I would miss one.
Alrighty.
So moving on to 2008 then, in January, so 2 months later, the Human Relation Manager begins fair housing activities under the local ordinance. This was in line, by the way, with what HUD had specifically advised them at the time. So they had in that briefing that the city council members met with representatives from HUD. They said the first step in achieving substantial equivalence is to pass an ordinance. And then the second question that HUD would have is, what are you doing with that ordinance? So in what ways are you pursuing these fair housing activities? And those include trainings, those include addressing fair housing complaints and investigations, and all of these were enacted under the local ordinance. In February 2008, so a month later, the human relations specialist was hired, and that was Tony Lowe. And that person was then the investigator and primary trainer on staff. In March 2008, so a month later, both the human relations specialist and the human relation manager began training with the National Fair Housing Training Academy. And that's something we mentioned last week, that one of the important parts of passing a local ordinance and seeking FAP status is that you are not able to attend the National Fair Housing Training Academy until you have begun that process. So while I, for example, could get some training on fair housing, I would not be able to get the official HUD National Fair Housing Training Academy training unless we were seeking FAP status and had passed the local ordinance. And that training, at least at the time, I don't know how it is now, Jelani may be able to speak to that, but that training was pretty significant. It consisted of, I believe, 5 separate weeks spread throughout the year of various things. And so they ultimately continued this training throughout the year. Their first week is in March, but then they have another week in April, another week, I believe, in July, et cetera, et cetera. In August of 2008, the human relation manager presents a fair housing update at the manager's briefing. And in this case, she's able to give a timeline of all the activities that have led up to this point and a small timeline of what's happening in the next few months. And she also notes that HUD has designated High Point a pre-FAP agency, meaning that they're still seeking certification and that they're evaluating the activities at the time. In October 2008, the human relation manager submits our FAP application to HUD. So that would include a summary of our activities as well as our ordinance in order to be certified as substantially equivalent. Are there any questions at this point? I know that's a lot of activities in that year. And I do just want to note, since I'm not seeing any questions, that the Human Relations Commission at the time is also actively involved in some of these issues. This is, of course, a high level. I'm not giving a blow by blow. This is what happened at every single meeting. So I know that the Human Relations Commission is at the time, for example, considering other procedures of how to enact this this new ordinance and process it as a commission, as a department. So those are all the things that are being prepared for that FAP application along the way, and they are actively involved in that process. So we'll move on to the next slide. And at this point, there's a lot of things that happen but they're much more spread out. So I'm not going to be addressing each element in the year. In October 2009, so this is a year after the FAP application was submitted, HUD declines the application for substantial equivalence, stating that the ordinance in particular was not compatible with Title VIII guidelines. And what this means is that while we had been designated a pre-FAP agency, we did not achieve substantial equivalence, and they provided the Human Relations Manager with some guidelines for revising the ordinance, which she reported she was working on with the city assistant attorney. And I will note that that is the last instance in the public record that I see. Does not mean it doesn't exist, but that I see in reference to the substantial equivalence. So I do not have that report of what kind of recommendations were made. We are currently seeking that we're probably going to reach out to HUD because we cannot find it in our records. And also we don't see any active or activity from council or anything subsequent to this about these guidelines. That does not mean that there weren't activities done or considerations being made, but just that I didn't find any in the records that I reviewed. 2 years later, basically in June 2011, the council cut the fair housing specialist position from the 2011-2012 budget. So this was the position that Tony Lowe filled, that was the investigator, and Tony Lowe had left earlier in the year, and so the position had already been open, and ultimately they just cut it from the budget. We fast forward then 4 years. I know that I have seen a record that there are still fair housing activities going on. Again, I'm not reporting everything. I see, for example, in 2012, there are notes that there were fair housing complaints made to the Human Relations Manager and the Human Relations Department. I have indication that those are being mediated, conciliated under the local ordinance. And so just because there's no note here in those 4 years doesn't mean that there weren't activities, but there were nothing significant that would present something worthy of our discussion tonight. In September 2015 then, so 4 years later, council revises the Human Relations Commission ordinance, and also subsequently at a special meeting discusses the city's involvement in fair housing. So they specifically want to address what we can think about and how the city should be approaching it. And this is also a reflection of thinking what was being happening. I don't have direct knowledge of exactly how this was changing, but I do know that though I have seen reports that in these minutes that there were still fair housing cases being mediated, they are fewer and farther between. So I don't, those updates are fewer and farther between. So I don't know how much activity was happening and exactly how those were being processed. What I do know is that in November 2015 and in September 2015, in those meetings were brought about because it was established that the way the Human Relations Office was investigating fair housing complaints, or was, I should say processing, because I don't even know if they were investigating, was not in line with the ordinance anymore, meaning that we wanted to evaluate that ordinance and see how we could bring it in line with current HRC practices. So in November of 2015, council reviewed the latest edition of the analysis of impediments. Like I said, that's a regular report. And at that meeting, they also established a new fair housing intake procedure, which was to, when the fair housing complaint comes in, we would refer that instead to the North Carolina Human Relations Commission. As I said last week, that is our current process. And I don't know if that was, Mr. McNair, who's on the call tonight, can tell us, because he was the one who was part of that fair housing intake procedure. But I do not know if that was something that was established at that time, or if that was already reflective of what we were doing. And so at this point, it was to just establish it formally for council. I believe it's the latter, that we had changed our practices. And that's why in January of 2016, council adopted an amended fair housing ordinance to reflect those current HRC practices and bring our ordinance in line with what we were doing. And that kind of, we remained with that, we still remain with that fair housing ordinance that was established in 2016. And that brought us all the way to today. And we still, as I said, follow that same intake procedure where we refer fair housing clients to the state. And so in 2021 then, the Human Relations Commission developed a work plan that included an item to explore the feasibility of High Point again becoming a FAP agency and pursuing this goal. And that was presented to the City Council, who approved the work plan and directed the Human Relations Commission to approach that. In May 2021, City Council invited the Human Relations Manager, at this point me, to present a fair housing report, which would also included Mr. Hollis and Mr. Biggs. And that was to present it to council for feedback. Mr. Hollis, you have your hand up?
Yeah, Race, just for clarity, can you go over the January 2021 bullet again?
Sure.
I think I I might have misunderstood it. Maybe others did too.
Absolutely. So every year, the Human Relations Commission has a retreat where we develop our work plan for the year based on like the concerns of the commission and the interests of the commission. And one item of that was to explore the feasibility of High Point becoming a FAP agency. So it was, and it was presented to council. Council approved that and asked us to explore that option. And this is kind of what we've been working on throughout the year, is to explore that feasibility. Does that clarify? Yeah,
but because I thought you said again, but the city of High Point had not been a fully substantial equivalent FAP agency before.
Correct. Right. So this was again pursuing a goal that we had not had before, and it would be something that would be new for us to become a FAP agency, and that is what we're pursuing. Yes, and the May report that we presented to council was specifically as they were developing the budget. That they wanted to say, do we need to budget for any of this? Should it come into being just as happened in a previous year? And as happens regularly, it is, we know these concerns are any kind of issue that's on the table for the year. We present that in our budget year as something to potentially be funded. And ultimately, council said they wanted to wait. They provided the Human Relations team with feedback for how to approach this issue and how to best explore the feasibility, and ultimately said that they would wait for that feedback and address any funding as an amendment later should we need it. And that's which leads us to today. So as part of that feedback, we developed this housing security workshop series. And this establishes a series under my direction to seek public feedback on the feasibility of High Point becoming a FAP agency. And that's how you've all ended up here right now. Bernita, you have something you'd like to add?
I guess my question is, what changed between the time period that council decided to adopt its current procedures and policies and the January 2021 work plan with the commission?
That's a great question. And since I wasn't here for that whole time, I'm going to defer to Manager Hollis since he was here during that time.
Hi, Benita, how are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you, Jerron?
Can you ask that question again? I may or may not have.
Well, if you go back to the previous slide,
Okay.
and in there on January 2016, council adopted an amended fair housing ordinance to reflect the current practices.
Mhm.
And then January 2021, if I think that the next slide states that the Human Relations Commission decided to put in its work plan, trying to achieve substantial equivalency or going back to the fair housing ordinance that was there before. So what changed in that time period with the Human Relations Commission that said we want to explore the feasibility of becoming a FAP agent? What prompted that?
Well, that's a great question, Bernita, and I'll offer my feedback. I've been with the organization since 2012 and have had the human relations function probably for the better part of 5 or 6 years. And I think one thing that's, in trying to answer your question, I think one thing that's important to remember is that from to even go back even further, the function of having a federal law that addresses fair housing and housing security goes all the way back to 1968, right? So the conversation about fair housing, the conversation about substantial equivalence, even though it reaches points where some people in certain levels aren't talking about it, there's been an undercurrent for 2 generations with fair housing throughout the community, throughout the state. So what you'll see, and this is I'm sharing information that a lot of you already know. You'll see some of our regional neighbors, your Charlottes, your Greensboros, your Winstons, who at different points along that timeline since '68 have decided to enact these programs. So I think from our commission standpoint, there have been several different iterations of the commission since 2007. Since 2007, HUD's processes, Mike and Jelani, for their experiences, can tell you how some of that has changed. HUD is different. Our understanding of fair housing is different, and some of the community needs are different, and then some are the same. So I think there have, if I can try to answer the question this way, Benita, I think there have been ongoing discussions and there has been a conversation about the need of fair housing, local fair housing in High Point since for years. Maybe even back to when Mr. Pettiford was here, who was our original human relations director. So one of the things that Race's timeline can't capture, because this is, he's not someone that is able to have fully mastered every second of time and captured into a PowerPoint. One of the things that his timeline doesn't reflect is some of the conversations. So our commission, our last 2 commissions really have had these questions about these and other issues, but we've had members on the commission that have asked. And I think if you look back at the transition from the previous ordinance that had been in place, that previous ordinance was a revision of the original ordinance offered at the time. So if we go back to 2007, and Mike, I don't know if I'm stepping on any of your lyrics here on when you sing your song next, but the original ordinance offered in 2007, from what we can see in the record, the original ordinance that was offered was something aligned with substantial equivalence. It's very similar to what you would have seen in Charlotte. You go to what was passed by the council. It was passed not in the form that it was originally presented in 2007. There were some changes that were made to that ordinance, and I think Race described wonderfully in the beginning. We're here reporting things as they happen. I wasn't there to be able to tell you the whys and the hows, but I just know what it is. And so there were changes made to that ordinance so that the ordinance that was submitted to HUD was different than the ordinance that was originally suggested to council, which we've got information that came back from HUD saying that the ordinance was not substantial equivalent, which was the purpose of the process. So you go from there to the changes in 2016, I believe, and the changes in 2016, although one of the items that was addressed was talking about the way High Point was doing fair housing. At that time, we were going through a period of transition. And I think some of the changes that we've had in human relations during my time here have been well documented in many public spaces. And I won't get into all of that. But one of the things that the changes in the ordinance brought about was a clearer understanding of what the functions were. And one of the functions that was in need of clarification didn't have anything to do with processing cases. It was more of an understanding of what the reporting structure was of the Human Relations Department, because as that ordinance was written before, there was this, the original intention, if you're a substantial equivalent agency, is some synergy with the commission and with the department. And so with the way the ordinance, with what it became and what it had been, it was almost like a Frankenstein. You had an ordinance that had pieces of a substantially equivalent Charlotte measure, and then pieces that were enacted by staff at the time for whatever reason. And so we were operating under something that had parts that looked like a substantial equivalent ordinance, and then had parts that really didn't make sense as being a substantial equivalent ordinance. And it created some confusion as far as the nature of the reporting structure for the Human Relations Department and some other staff and personnel things, in addition to any discussion that was about cases and investigations. So one of the outcomes was that a process was established that got the process of intake moved to a stronger relationship with the State Human Relations Commission. That was done as a way to address those issues and those cases that up until that time really were not being handled at all from a city standpoint because of some of those changes. That's probably the longest answer to the shortest question, Bernita, but hopefully that helps.
Yes, to some degree, but I've got 1,000 more questions that I'm gonna hold on and see what else happens. So thank you, Jerron, for your response.
Thank you, Mr. Hollis. And I think that it is important to note that we don't have a record of any of the, what we have is a record of the ordinance that was passed, and we know that it was not substantially equivalent. So, we know that there were some good faith efforts made there. And that's what brings us to today. I am going to move on to ultimately let Mike in here to talk about the analysis of impediments. And so I'm going to stop sharing this screen. And Mike, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Good evening, everyone. And let me get my screen shared here, if I may find it. Okay. Not in excruciating detail, more of a summary and an overview. And I'm getting a message that my internet connection is unstable. So if I drop out, let me know and I'll repeat whatever I just said. But
a technical issue, Mike, if you're having some connection issues, we found if you see us jumping, maybe if you want to cut your camera off so that you can save some of your bandwidth, if you get in trouble, that might buy you some time. And we'll try to remember what you look like.
Well, will that turn off? That won't turn off my screen, will it?
No.
No?
And if you are having too many technical difficulties, Mike, I could pull up your presentation on my screen, FYI.
Okay. All righty. So let me get to rolling here. The analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, we all just call it the AI, is a review that the city has to do every 5 years. All entitlement cities that receive HUD funds have to do this review, and we have to tell HUD how we're going about affirmatively furthering fair housing. Now, over the years, that has changed somewhat. If you recall, during the previous administration, the analysis of impediments and fair housing definitions were changing, and now they have changed back. But the idea behind the analysis of impediments, again, is to identify impediments to fair housing choice, which basically means, are there either practices, are we seeing something in your community that's limiting the choices available to people? Sex, national origin, status, or handicap of similar income levels have anything to do with the availability of your housing choice. And so that's what the AI seeks to look at. And as I said, we have to do this every 5 years, submit it to HUD. We provide an update every year when we do our annual report as to how we're doing with our fair housing activities. So, and again, this is not exhaustive. In the interest of time, I just kind of grabbed some high level stuff, but we're seeing things that affect fair housing choice, and like, for instance, low appraisal values. What that does is it kind of knocks the private sector out of the affordable housing market. We find that if you can't build a house, or if you can't get it financed or get it appraised for what it costs to build it, it creates an issue. And that's the problem you run into. Is you have in core city neighborhoods a lot, we're seeing appraisals that are below cost. And the only way we can get housing done is for the city to come in and provide a subsidy to the builder so that the house can be built and sold to income eligible folks. Then we have the not in my backyard issue. It truly amazes me the things that people will come in the city hall and say into a microphone when we have multifamily affordable housing projects that are up for consideration. And there have been several where, you know, over the years where the change but it's a big issue. People don't want it in their neighborhoods, but that gets into that fair housing choice, that availability of affordable housing to you. And then we see, you know, just the numbers. Someone asked me one time, what's our affordable housing deficit, which basically is how many units are we shy, how many households are either living in cost burden situations or living in substandard housing, things like that. And we, I believe one council asked me that, and I told them it was about 4,500 households, or 4,500 units. And the response I got was, well, I don't believe that. The newspaper's full of it, full of listings. And I said to them, I said, well, let's just say you don't accept that. How many families are on the waiting list at the Housing Authority? Yeah, that's a good 1,500 people. Those are people that you don't have to do the math. That's just people who've gone out and filled a form. So there's clearly a deficit out there. There's a greater need than we have either available housing or housing that's safe, sanitary, and decent. And what we've looked at when we look in the housing market, what we're seeing is as you go down the income level, as you get to, as you drop below 80% of the median, you just can't afford what's out there. And that's the problem. That's what creates the deficit. People have to, in order to meet, be able to get the housing that's available, they have to either double up or they have to pay 50, 60% of their income, or they're also, because they have costs. So all those things kind of fall in together. Did I
Mike,
hear-
if I can interrupt, we've lost you about 2 or 3 times. Can I get Race to share the PDF version and maybe try you with audio if you can see his slide? Can we try that?
Yeah, and I'll turn my camera off too.
Yeah, let's see if that helps. And so just
I'm
excuse
sorry
us,
about that.
folks, while we work out some technical things.
Okay.
Okay, you still there, Mike?
Yeah, I'll stop the share. Okay, you did it. Okay.
Okay.
You just let me know when to move on.
Okay. I'm glad we did that this morning. Okay. Let's go to slide number. Yes. Okay. Issues affecting fair housing choice. We just talked about that one. Go to the next one, please. Okay. So within the conduct of the AI, and we don't do this internally, we hire consultants to do this. And they look in these different areas. They look at the housing market, rental housing, housing for sale. They look at brokerages, mortgage services. They look at our public policies and actions. And then they we look at our administrative policies, and then they look at any housing discriminations cases that may have shown up at HUD. They look at those things to see if there's anything systemic or something that we need to take a look at. We've had some issues in the past where, it seemed that affordable housing developments did not get, from what I saw at times, did not get passed at the same rate as market rate developments when it came through PN.
Mike, we've lost your audio again.
Yeah, we're missing some important content there.
Okay, we'll see if we can.
You got me back?
Yeah, Mike, we lost you. We lost you at market rate and affordable housing approvals.
Yeah, I was talking about as part of the process, as we have to go through planning and zoning, and that's when the people come in and flood the council chambers. And that's where, you get into a little friction there. And sometimes we don't make it through that. But I think that's gotten better though. I think that's just been a matter of awareness. Okay, Race, go to the next one. So the AI identified these impediments to fair housing choice in High Point. And a lot of these, frankly, are not unique to High Point. A lot of cities in the South have these same issues. But I think the supply of affordable housing, we already touched on that. There's not enough of it. The demand is extremely high. We try to get, we're trying to leverage dollars and get as much multifamily housing out there and as we can. We've been fortunate to get about 500 units out there over the last 10 years, but that's a drop in the bucket. But we're still pushing on it, and I think we're going to see some more development come soon. There are some financial incentives that were passed in the stimulus package back in December that's going to make affordable housing development in the core city more of a reality. So that's one thing we're looking forward to. Lack of accessible housing that has to do with ADA handicapped housing. And then you have the physical, economic, social barriers. That's the NIMBYism we were talking about. And this, these impediments, this AI is not just for community development. It actually is for the city of High Point. So there are items in the AI where sometimes we'll meet with HR and say, okay, those are yours, or we may go to another department and say, well, those are yours. And so we have to work out who's doing what. Obviously, fair housing awareness falls into human relations arena. And then the lack of economic opportunities is more of a higher level city at High Point, but there's a connection between economic opportunities, obviously, and affordable housing choice, what you can afford and where you can afford to live. Okay, Race. If anybody has any questions, by any means, stop me.
Mike,
Right.
I don't see any questions in the chat. I don't know. Does anyone have any questions that they wanted to address right now? I don't see any of those. Mike, I just wanted to ask a quick question about this myself. These are the identified impediments to fair housing choice. I assume this is from the most recent report,
This is the 2020, yes.
2020. And so this is a report, I know the answer to this, but just to make sure everyone knows, this is a report you do how often?
Every 5 years.
And the last question would be just, are these always the same impediments, or it's really that, is it different each year?
They tend to be fairly similar because these are long-term issues. It's, the inadequate supply of housing is not going to correct itself in 5 years. And so many of these are things that you just keep your eye on the ball and keep working on them. And, one of the things we tell HUD when we're working on this thing, that we have to report, what are you doing to address these impediments? And we have to tell them, well, we did 100 units of new affordable housing, or we built 10 units of single family affordable housing. So it's those types of, we worked with HR to conduct workshops, or we underwrote a fair housing event, anything like that. So we have to share that stuff. But no, they don't change that much. And even though the AIs, if you look at the older ones, were done by different agency, different consultants rather, the conclusions were not that different. And so it's a continuing issue.
Thank you. I'll move on since I don't see any other questions.
Okay.
I do have a question raised. This is Bernita. How do you define accessible housing? What does that mean?
That's ADA accessible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff people can't get in and out of, and the landlord may not make it accessible, and they need to. Okay, Race. So out of these impediments, we have these fair housing goals, and as you can see, they're pretty much a restatement of the impediments, basically to fix the impediment. So you said you had a shortage of affordable housing, you need to have an increase. So that's essentially how they're working through. But when you get into the document, there's quite a bit more detail. It's just, again, this is a summary, because otherwise we would be here all night. These documents are very long and very involved and very detailed. But essentially, the fair housing goals become directly associated with the impediment itself that was already identified. Okay, Race. So some of the things that we told HUD that we would do was to continue many of the ongoing efforts that we have. We have funds for home repair programs. We do special projects like Operation Inasmuch to help seniors and other households conserve existing affordable housing and help people age in place. We will continue to provide incentives to construct and or repair affordable housing throughout the city for low-income households. And then we will continue to work with the elderly and disabled for accessibility improvements to their homes. Now, I want to share with you just sort of a connection between an AI finding and the result becoming a new program. One of the things that was identified in our previous AI was that we had a lot of what they call racially concentrated areas of poverty in High Point that were located in the core city. Basically, it's identified as neighborhoods of greatest needs. And so and the recommendation from the AI was to, you need to attract more younger middle income people into the core city to help diversify some of these RCAPs, what they call. And so what we did was we already had a down payment assistance program for the core city. We approached council and we said, hey, what if you underwrite this, we can come out with a program where we can encourage people of all income levels to come to move into the core city and buy homes. We'll still have federal funding for people that are income eligible, and then people who are above that level could receive assistance through or incentive from the general fund. And council approved that. We've been doing that now for about 5 or 6 years, and I believe we're well over 200 homes that were purchased. And our stats are telling us that the average household income of those 200 buyers was 97% of the median, which tells us that's exactly where we were trying to get. So you get a mixture of incomes, you get folks coming in and providing, frankly, the basis for small businesses and things like that. And most of those, and we knew that most of those would be coming in from, say, Lexington, that side of going towards Emerywood, that side of the core city. But that's begun to actually come down closer to HPU now. So we're seeing a lot of activity in the core. There's still some areas that it's hard to get home ownership into, but it's been used as a business recruiting tool by economic development folks. It's a very unique program. I'm fairly certain that nobody in North Carolina is doing it. And I read about places across the country that are doing something similar. I said, well, they ought to be talking. We need to be in that article. But anyhow, I just wanted to share that with you. Let's see. Oh, you got that. Can you go to the next one, sir? This is where, and that's what I was just actually speaking about, was getting outside of the RCAPs, the racially concentrated areas of poverty, to provide people, low-income people in High Point need to have the opportunities or the option to live in a high opportunity area. And you get, frankly, you get kind of strange pushback. You get some folks that say, I live in the core, I don't want to leave the core, and that's fine. We're not going to force anybody to leave. But every time that we have a development in North High Point, the developer has a waiting list of 1,000 people, so or more. They fill up, just like that. So we know that there's something that HUD has encouraged us to do. However, as I said earlier, we anticipate having more development in the core city in the near future, and that'll kind of balance that out. Before, we were kind of locked into, we were going to North High Point because basically that's where the state wanted to go. It's in that tax credit process is very competitive, and they had, their priority was being in low census tracts with low poverty rates. And some of these developments you've seen or may have heard of, we have Admiral Point, which is over there by the neighborhood Walnut off of Wendover. You got Addington Ridge, you got Kirkwood, you got Hartley Ridge. Avondale Trace just opened up. Another elderly is about to get underway called Abbey Crossing. And then another project was approved by council further up Wendover. Wendover West would be 216 units out there. So, that's been we've done pretty well with that, I think, especially for a city our size. But again, our needs are great. So again, these activities to overcome impediments pretty much reflect what the impediments that were identified. And we work with some of those, again, it's the city, it's not so much CD. So a lot of those you see Race and company will be doing something like that as they interact with the realtors and whatnot. Okay, can you go to the next one, Race? Okay.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
This is Councilman Johnson. Quick question for you, Mike.
Yes, sir.
Has any of the analysis of the impediments mentioned anything specifically about having a fair housing program?
I'm trying to recall. There is let's see. This is I can't open that because he's got it. These are voluminous documents. I'm trying to recall if it mentions that or not. I think it did. Certainly, I know it spoke about paired testing and things like that. I'm fairly sure that it was a suggestion that the city pursue that. I'm gonna get out of my lane here for a second, but in my mind, frankly, as the old civil rights folks used to say, justice delayed is justice denied. And I really think that it's a disadvantage to residents in High Point not to have access to some local assistance in that arena. But that's just my opinion. I can find that and get that to you, Mr.
Okay.
Mike, I can also chime in just to say that I haven't read each of your analysis of impediments, so I'm at a bit of a loss here. But in the Human Relations Commission meeting in 2006, you did present the analysis of impediments to the Human Relations Commission. And one of them specifically was a lack of appropriate local legislation to address fair housing issues. And I don't know that, how that relates now, but I do know that that was one of the items addressed at that time.
Thank you. And Mike, again, it's Councilman Johnson. Quick question. Will we be able to get a copy of this presentation?
Certainly. Race already has it.
Okay.
But I put these two documents up here at the end just so they're on our website. The analysis of impediments is part of the consolidated plan. So we have the consolidated plans that talks about what we're going to do with the HUD dollars. The analysis of impediments talks about what we should be doing in the consolidated plan. It's supposed to inform the consolidated plan. What are you doing to address the impediments that you found in the AI? So those two have to talk to each other in that process. And I know that's a long link. I just put it up there for the heck of it. But if you go to community development website and go to, you'll see a tab that says plans. You can find it in and there'll be a link to fair housing. And I think Race, you have a link for this on your website, don't you? For the AI?
We might, I don't know. I'm not positive, but I do know that I've looked for the analysis of impediments before on your portion of the site and it was very easy to find.
But, it's, when we presented the council, to really get in depth with it, we end up having a manager's briefing. I think if you recall, when we did it in 2020, had the consultants come in. But it's a lot of information to try to digest in one sitting. But I think we met with council and probably talked to them about an hour. But it takes a lot longer than an hour, obviously, to digest all the information. So but but it's our documents, the City of High Point's document, and we try to implement the action plan, the Fair Housing Action Plan, and whatever we said we were going to do, because HUD holds us accountable for what we say. So, yes, sir, it's out there. It may be that in the course of this review that at some point maybe we want to revisit that. You know, maybe some kind of meeting where that gets pulled out again, you can talk about it. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Mike.
Grace, this is Bernita again. I have a question for Mike. As some expansion happens in the core, or let's say with the expansion of High Point University and other things that are happening where housing is being removed, do we have a way to determine whether or not, as you're doing or replacing that housing with tax credit units and other methods, are we replacing one for one, or what are we doing as we remove housing stock and we build new housing stock? Are we at some type of 1-to-1 ratio or 2-to-1 ratio? Is there a way to determine where we are in that process? You say we don't have enough housing, but I guess my question is, are we working in some sort of concerted way to make sure that we're at least replacing what's being removed?
We're not going through a list and comparing, but I can tell you we are putting out more than what we're taking down. We tend to be, we generally are averaging, I think, anywhere from 80 to 100 units a year of either new construction or combination new construction and home repairs, probably close to 150 a year. So not only are we doing new housing, but we're helping people stay in their housing. Mm-hmm. Now, the demolition that you see occurring, the takedowns that you're referring to, frankly, are properties that need to go down because landlords won't repair them. And it's really tough, and we very rarely run into properties that are occupied. That can be an issue, but there is a way to, we could ascertain, like comparing demo permits, for instance, versus new construction that we're directly involved in. So we have some sensing of it, and I'm certain actually that we are putting up more than what's coming down. It's just that it's not, when we say that it's not enough, Benita, we're saying that it's not enough to meet the needs of the people. There's housing out there, but in many cases it's either substandard or it costs too much, and relative to what the people make. And so in High Point, we have, probably 20-25% of the population that are pretty low income. And if you look at, if you look at the qualified census tracts, which you'll be hearing about that soon with the ARP stuff, we're just full of it. I mean, we have a lot of census tracts where more than 50% of the people are at 60% or below. And that's when you look at the marketplace, if you take, this is one thing I've done this before, you take the prevailing rents and you do the math, say, okay, how much do I need to make to afford that rent? And that's what the issue is. So if affordable rent for me is $300 a month, then you look at the marketplace and say, what can I get for $300 a month? And if you look in the papers, there's not much out there. And that's where it is. That's the problem, is the mismatch between what people can afford and what the prices are. The market is looking at, 100% of the median income. They're not really looking at people that are, further down. So,
And Mike, I just want to tie this back real quick. So like when you're identifying these impediments, one being this kind of mismatch between what people make versus what the housing is, I think that maybe is it fair to say that one of the things you were getting at earlier when you were trying to address this question was that that this creates a situation where folks are more likely to be in a situation where they need to seek out fair housing assistance. Like if I know that I am in a situation, for example, where perhaps I have complaints and I believe that my that my landlord is not addressing them, but that I need to seek out answers. And so those could be addressing it in various situations. And one possible solution, which is why we're exploring this, is a local fair housing office. As you identified, for example, a lot of these folks are elderly or might be from different protected classes, such as those who have disabilities. Is that a fair characterization of this?
well, I think we're looking at two different sides of the issue. You're looking at one side that may, you get into landlord tenant issues and things like that. But the other side speaks to what's available in the marketplace and what City of High Point, what role are you playing in that? So for instance, if we have, whether it has anything with CD or not, if somebody comes to council with an affordable housing development and council does not approve it because NIMBYism, then that's you've affected fair housing choice. And the laws are very clear about you can't make decisions based on those 7 protected classes. And as you've seen, all of you have seen, people become very adept at when they don't mention that when they go in there. They don't say, I don't want those people in my neighborhood. They'll come in and say, the land doesn't perk. This is bad for the environment. That kind of stuff. So it's two sides of the same coin. So you get into, because when there's nothing in the marketplace, then you're forced to deal with some of these, I don't want to use the term, but less than desirable properties, I put it that way. And then you're forced to rent places that, again, maybe the landlord tells you, yeah, come on in, I'll fix this, and then they never fix it. And then you're in there breathing mold and all this stuff. So it's a combination of both. It's not an either or. Does that make any sense? You see what I'm trying to say? You get into, from one side, you get into the how you're dealing with the demand in your community. And the other side is sort of how are you addressing the fair housing needs of your community? So it's a multifaceted problem. And that's why when you look at the AI, it has multiple sections about different pieces in there. And again, I just went at a very high level.
And I think that kind of building on that, like what you're saying is that and I'm bringing this up just because this was one of the things I've seen before in discussions with council, but also throughout these HRC meeting minutes and council minutes that I reviewed, that some of those are just minimum housing complaints, correct? And some of those then would become fair housing complaints, and that an organization would be able to make a distinction between them both and would not necessarily treat every instance of mold as a fair housing complaint, because that's not how you'd process that. Is that correct?
Right. But if you do have a fair housing issue, if that situation has to be adjudicated by the state, then the complainant is a great disadvantage. And people oftentimes will just give up and leave. And that's why I say justice delayed is justice denied, because you don't really get to the issue.
And I think in particular, just looking at the impediments that you saw in 2020, that in particular refers to, just as one example, a lack of accessible housing. We've talked about, for example, that a lot of fair housing, the majority of fair housing complaints are dealing with ADA law, not with, say, national origin or something like that.
And if you need an ADA compliant living space, the landlord says, I won't accommodate you. Where are you? You know, so it's, and there's no local remedy available, then it's just, you just have the person tied up in a knot.
Mr. Hollis, I saw your hand up.
Yeah, and I think Mike brings up some excellent points, and I think it's important just from a synergy standpoint to kind of underscore the relationship with community development and human relations that we have, and how important those things are. There's sometimes where we are sort of fishing in the same pond. I think because of the questions, and Mike gave, like you said, Mike gave an excellent high-level review here. I think back to, one of Bernita's questions, and then one of Councilmember Johnson's questions. I think what we can do is I think there were some questions about fair housing assistance programs related to the analysis of impediments. So I think what we can do, as we are doing with answering questions, as we get the information in, we do get questions between sessions. So, Race, maybe it might be a good idea to include, if there are any additional documents or information related, discussing in the analysis of impediments related to a fair housing program, that we can make that available to the group, or to the public through this group. That might be helpful to sort of fish out some of the answers to a few of the questions that we had today.
Absolutely. When I send my next email update, which I hope all of you received most recently last week or on Monday, I'll include anything that ties those together. At this point, do we have any questions from the attendees? Anything that feel needs to be addressed more further? I'm not seeing anything come through in the chat, and I don't see anyone raising their hands to talk. So I think in that sense, I think we've reached the end of the history. I just want to reiterate then that just as we talked about last week, my email is available. I'm race.mccrae@highpointnc.gov. If at any point you have questions, then we'll be able to take them and address them, as Mr. Hollis said, through email. And also any questions that you have would then be read into the record at a subsequent workshop, so that everyone can have the answers to those questions and we can disperse that information. And I want to also just thank you again for joining us. Thank you all of these guests, and thank you, Mike, for giving us another presentation. All of us benefited from that. And I just want to remind you as well then that our next workshop is happening next Tuesday. That's really crucial. It's not on a Thursday. So it's these first two are on Thursdays and the next two are on Tuesdays. So it will be next week, Tuesday, August 3rd, and it will again start at 5:30. Just as a reminder, if you don't have any Zoom link or anything to attend that, you can send that my way, and we'll get that fixed for you. And that presentation will be on the legal aspects of fair housing, and we will have a special guest who is a lawyer working for the Fair Housing Assistance Program in Winston-Salem. So any final comments before we send out, Mr. Hollis, or anybody else?
We want to thank everyone that attended today. I wanted to especially thank I saw Councilmember Johnson, of course, Councilmember Holmes. I think we had some staff participation. Mr. McNair, I see our Deputy City Attorney, Megan McGuire, and then all of our partners, Mr. Crittlebaugh, I'm gonna miss some names what I can't read, and Ms. Gilbert, Madeline, Miguel, and Patrick. So just thank you. This is important information. And one of the things that we wanted to do with this workshop was objectively put information out there to get feedback and to give information so that everybody knows more. And I find that when we have more information, we make better decisions. So, so thank you all for attending, and I'll turn it back over to Race.
Yeah, the last thing I'll say is just that we will be trying to put together, just like we did last time, a summary minutes of this, and we will, because we recognize that it's Tuesday, and that's a shorter amount of time to review that, we will try to have that out to you tomorrow. Thank you. Miguel, did you have something to say real quick? I just saw you on mute. And I don't know.
Yeah, probably. What can I say is while we can all hope that discrimination does not occur in North Carolina, neither in our area, we cannot rely on hope alone to ensure that we, as a realtors, our members treat everyone with the respect and dignity that they deserve, and to which they are legally entitled. So we appreciate your support and partnership as we continue this very important work learning with this workshop too.
Thank you, Miguel. I can't think of a better way to go out on that. So I appreciate everyone for being here. And at that, I'm going to conclude the meeting.